think it's time to get started for tonight. Good evening, and welcome to the first lecture of the second year of the Humanities on the Edge speaker series. My name is Norman Baker, and I'm an assistant professor at the English department here at UNL, and I am one of the three co-organizers of the speaker series. I see Marco Abel, who is my partner in crime. He's an associate professor here at the English department also, and the third person is Janet Jones from the history department. Before introducing our speaker tonight, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors for making the second year of the series possible. So tonight's event was funded by the Sheldon Museum of Art, the College of Arts and Sciences, UNL's Research Council, and the Faculty Senate, the Departments of English, Modern Languages, History, Political Science, and the 19th Century Studies program. And last but not least, I also would like to thank all of you who are sitting here in the audience tonight for your interest in our guest speakers, and we are indeed very grateful for the support of our colleagues, students, and friends. And I know some of you have been following the speaker series from last year, but I did want to say as an introduction just a few words about the idea behind the speaker series, and that will be, I think, a good introduction of why Sarah is actually here tonight. So those of you who followed the first year of the series already know that we decided to rely on the metaphor of the edge in the title of the speaker series in order to evoke the inherent ambiguity of this figure. So the title of our speaker series was intended to evoke the general rhetoric of crisis that seems to have invaded virtually every aspect of our lives, and especially for those of us who work in the humanities. More so than ever, we live in a perpetual state of mobilization, and nothing is more self-evident to us today than the fact that one crisis follows another. Yet, we wanted to invite speakers who do not content themselves with the mere diagnosis of the crisis. In this spirit, then, last year, our first speaker, Stephen Shabiro, talked about the necessity of reinventing the utopian imagination for the 21st century. Our second speaker, Jeffrey Nealon, argued for a positive and active role for literature after the age of postmodernism. Sandy Cohen spoke up on behalf of academic institutional experimentation in order to keep the spirit of criticism alive in an age of anti-intellectualism. And Anna Sola-Cloud concluded the year with a discussion of the concept of social antagonism. As a continuation of the same project, this year we decided to concentrate on the problems of biopower and biopolitics, because it appears to us that the current theoretical debates concerned with these concepts hold out the promise of a new and inventive way of engaging the crises that define our era. And if these terms are not familiar to you, I'm going to have to disappoint you. I'm not going to define them here right now, because I'm hoping that our guests will do this work for us. In fact, I hope that the discussions that we initiate here tonight will do this work. So, looking ahead, I would like to point out that our next event this semester is scheduled for November 17th, same place, same time, when Jody Dean, professor of political science from Hobart and William Smith Colleges, will discuss the contemporary state of democracy through a critique of participatory media. In the spring semester, Michael Hart from Duke University, who barely needs an introduction these days, will talk about what he calls a biopolitical New Deal. This is going to be March 29th. And Cesare Casalino from the University of Minnesota will discuss the idea of universalism of the common. This talk will be on April 12th. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Sarah Guyon is Associate Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In addition, she is also the Director of Madison Center for the Humanities, an institution whose mission appears to be quite in line with our vision for our own speaker series. At the same time, she is also affiliated faculty of the Center for Jewish Studies, Global Studies, and the Center for European Studies. She is the author of numerous articles, in fact too many to enumerate, so I will mention only her group projects here. Her first book, Romanticism After Auschwitz, was published by Stanford University Press in 2007. The book establishes an unsettling connection between post-Holocaust testimonial narratives and the rhetoric of survival in Romanticism. It argues that post-Holocaust survival stories have remained essentially romantic in nature. This insight provides the foundation of Dr. Guyon's argument that the very category of Romanticism needs to be rethought today, since the tools of literary history that have failed to come to terms with some of the most important aspects of romantic works of literature. In fact, it's precisely the persistence after Auschwitz of these unsettling aspects of romantic works that we should pay attention to, since the concept of life, articulated by the normative accounts of Romanticism, displays a deep affinity with the concept of life revealed in Nazi concentration camps. Currently, Dr. Guyon is working on two other book projects. Bookality, A Rhetoric of the Mouth, is an attempt to question the predominance of visual metaphors in literature, critical theory, and psychoanalysis by examining the role of the mouth in the works of authors like Freud, Deleuze, Derrida, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Beckett, Kafka, and others. If I'm not mistaken, tonight's talk is taken from the other project. This book is entitled Romanticism and the Poetics of Homelessness. Through an examination of the works of Jean Clair and Friedrich Hölderlin, this book will provide us a new look at Romanticism and the aesthetic nationalisms that it gave rise to, by defining Romanticism as neither local nor cosmopolitan. The title of Dr. Guyon's story is right here on the slide behind me. A Poet is Born, Not Made, Jean Clair's Grave and the Politics of Life. Please join me in welcoming Sir Guy to Nebraska and to UNL, who was kind enough to interrupt his sabbatical leave to accept an invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, all of you who are here, and also several of you met with me and talked this afternoon about some of this work, and it was a really great conversation and a wonderful introduction to the University of Nebraska. So, as I look at the slide here, I think that there's very little actually on the politics of life as such in this talk. It's probably more about the poetics of life. So. We'll think a lot about the relation between the politics and the poetics of life. In fact, this project, or this part of my project, begins with an observation. And that observation is that Michel Foucault, in one of the texts that has been taken as a fundamental contribution to our thinking about biopower and biopolitics, argues that in the late 18th and early 19th century, there was a shift in conceptions of sovereignty and power. And that shift was a shift from power obtained through the ability to kill, the ability to make die, from that to a power as a capacity to make live. At the same time, in England, poets are newly interested in questions of life. And we see this in a number of different kinds of ways. We see this in a kind of obsession with apostrophic poetry and the rhetoric of animation. We also see this, and critics more recently have begun to observe, we see this in an interest in the biological or the life sciences, and the way in which vitalism becomes a central term for poetry. So I'm interested in the way in which these two emergences happen to coincide. They're happening at more or less the same moment, in more or less the same places in and around Europe. And very little has been said or written about how these two moments relate to one another. So the account of the politics of life tends to have very little to say about, or the account of biopolitics tends to have, and biopower tends to have very little to say about poetry. And discussions of poetry and discussions of romantic poetry in particular, whether they're focused on creativity or genius, or even more intensely focused on the life sciences, have not yet taken on this question of biopolitics. And I'm interested not necessarily in why that's the case, but how we might begin to remedy this situation, how we might begin to think through this pause or gap, even an implicit tension. Partly due to the way in which different critical or theoretical discourses seem to emerge alongside one another without necessarily entering into conversation with one another. So, in saying that, it's also worth pointing out for a second what I'm not going to talk about in this paper or in this project, although it's something that could be talked about, which is I'm not looking at literature, and I said this earlier today when I spoke with some of you, I'm not looking at literature as just a witness to, or just an archive of what's happening in the world, right? I'm not interested in literature just as a kind of mimetic account or thematization of a set of biopolitical problems or biopolitical emergences that are happening in the culture at large, but rather to think about how literature and poetry in particular, in the example that I'm going to look at this evening, how literature shares structurally with biopolitics, its obsession with life and making live. How literature comes to be a form or a vehicle of making live, not just representing what's happening as we can see in novels, or we can see even in the case of John Clare, about whom I'll speak this evening, but its ambition or its mode or its way of emerging in this particular moment, what we call Romanticism, has a very fine resemblance to what's happening elsewhere. So just to kind of point out that difference. And then finally, this evening I'll be looking at the example of John Clare. Some of you haven't been reading Clare for a long time or introduced him this week. Some of you may not know anything about John Clare, so I hope that you'll learn a little bit about him. Now, one of the things that might seem counterintuitive, and you might already know this, or if you don't hear this from me, you'll hear it from Michael Hart later on this year, is that biopower tends to involve the multitude. It tends to look at the scale of the population, to consider not the individual, but the species or race. This is something that Foucault identifies and that Hart has done a lot to think about. So it might seem kind of counterintuitive or even strange to focus on an individual life or an individual death, a death that, as we'll see, is far from individual but multiple and complex, as I suppose all deaths are. But to focus on an individual. And I want to suggest that by thinking about this example or this allegory, we can get a handle on some of the key aspects of this connection between the poetic and the political in the 19th century, the romantic and the biopolitical, that maybe just thinking at the scale of the population might not allow us to see. And in terms of methodology, I tend to be most interested in and work by way of close reading, which also might seem to be a methodology that isn't particularly attuned to thinking about the scale of a population or the scale of a species, right? I mean, it's detailed and very, very local, rather than some of the work by, say, the digital humanities that looks at a corpus, right? But I want to suggest that there's value in continuing to do close reading, and that's part of what's at stake today. So. Grave 1, the Journal of 1824. Like I said, it should be, I don't know if it's actually, John Clare's Graves, probably, not just grave, but alas. In October of 1824, a full 40 years before his actual death, John Clare, suffering from a severe but not unusual bout of illness and 3 nights of dreaming that he'd gone to hell, decided to compose his will and sketch his grave. Now, by the autumn of 1824, Clare had been recognized as a poet, albeit a peasant poet, who exemplified the vision of poetry that William Wordsworth advocated in his manifesto-like preface to Lyrical Ballads.